Okay, thank you very much for joining. So today we've come to our second tutorial for our programming and scripting unit. So what we're going to look into today's session, we're going to look into design a computer program to a client brief with a consideration of the user interface. So what are we required to do? We have to have the ability to design and document functionality for a computer program to meet our client brief. Also design a document that the user interface will now have to meet our client brief. Also for this tutorial, we have a merit learning outcome where we have to justify your design decisions for both the functionality and the user interface. So what have we done in our previous tutorial? We have introduced computer programming. We explain some of the major differences between high-level programming languages and low-level programming languages, which now comes down to explain what are the difference between programming and scripting. So we looked and we analyzed both of them, and we also explain some of the fundamentals concepts. So now we're progressing to a case scenario where we'll be now presented with a client who has requirements. So our stakeholders now wants to know time frame, scope, aim, and the purpose of our software. So we have to be able to brief them and document them regarding all they need to know about the software. So as we can see, designing computer program according to client brief will now involve several critical stages. So we're now going to recall our system development life cycle, where we have to include planning phase, implementation, testing, and maintenance. So looking into our system development life cycle, we need to understand our client brief. So we need to understand what they want to achieve, what is the end goal of our software. So we have to have the ability to be gathering requirements. We need to be able to define the scope, where we're going to establish what we'll now include in the initial version of our program. And we have to set objectivities. So we need to be able to use our system development life tools for us to achieve our goals within the time frames. Planning phase is now going to include our designing architecture. So we're going to choose our appropriate architecture depending on if we're going to work with agile methodology or extreme programming or whatever. We have to have the ability to determine how different component of our program is going to interact as well. We have to also creating flowchart and diagrams. So with the use of flowchart to map out the logic and the flow of the program. So we also look more into details to ERD diagrams and so on. So we now understand how important it is for us to have a system if we have the ability to manage our system effectively. Also, we're going to be defining data models, where we're going to design the data models and database. which is needed for our program, such as our DBMS. Also, it is important for us to implement the code where we're going to be choosing a suitable programming language, write modular code, or maybe object-oriented programming code, testing and debugging, and so on. Also, we have to design our user interface, our UI. So with the principle of UI design, we're going to use UI, which should be simple and easy to navigate. So we'll now create sketch or wireframe that will now give us a layout for our interface, and we can now provide it to our client for feedback. Also, there are loads of various tools when it comes to user interface designing, such as Figma, Adobe XD, and so on. So here we have examples of designing a task management application. So this example will be very similar to our assignment brief. So in this example, we have our client brief that says that the client needs a task management application to help users organize and track the daily tasks. The application should allow users to add, edit, and delete tasks, set deadlines, and mark tasks as completed. So the user interface should be intuitive and accessible on both desktop and mobile device. So again, looking at this assignment brief, we will have to be able to understand our client brief, and we have to have the ability to create an application that follows our CRUD operation: create, read, update, and delete. And then we will look into the planning of our program structure. So we'll look into an architecture such as the model view controller. We'll now also include flowcharts and diagrams for our user interface. Also, when it comes to implementing the code, it will be a full web application where front end will now include HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for front end, and we can now use Python with Flash for the backend. So here we have an example of pseudocode. When it comes to designing our UI, we have to look into the principles where we're going to be minimizing the design with a clear label and button. So we have to also be consistent with the use of color and fonts. And also with the feedback, this task status will update us with visual indicators. So here is a pseudocode of how our user interface will present our front-end framework. And this will be done with the use of Bootstrap. So now we're going to look into our learning outcome 1, where we're going to design and document the functionality for a computer program to meet a client brief. So when it comes to designing and document functionality for mobile app using Python, we'll now have to design a mobile app to meet the client brief, where in essential, we'll now be using various solution design tools. So these tools to visualizing will now include data flow and interaction. So we will now have some example of these tools used for mobile application, and they'll all be coded with Python. So again, we've been presented with another scenario where the client requires a mobile task management app to help users organize tasks and organize and track their daily tasks. So the app should allow users to add, edit, and delete tasks, set deadline, mark tasks as completed. So the user interface should be intuitive, suitable for mobile devices. Here are a couple of tools that will now help us to create an effective design. So we earlier on mentioned entity relationship diagram. So this is a tool which is very much used when it comes to creating databases. And when we're looking into DBMS, which are database management system, where we're able to work with entity and attributes, and it is very important because when data is stored into our database, it is important for us to not have too much data. So we have to be able to break down our data into smaller table, and this process is called normalization. So we have example for flowcharts, where flowcharts provide a graphical representation of sequences of operation in the app. Yeah, as we mentioned, we now visualize the data and the relationship within the app. We do have an example for them. Data flow diagrams are going to show how data flows through these apps. So also below, we will now include context level of data flow diagram for the task management app. Unified modeling language, which is a class diagram, shapes the structure of the app by showing the app into classes, attributes, and relationships. Data modeling is now going to define the structure of our database tables, and we do have a pseudocode here. Also, pseudocode helps in outlining the logic of the app before the actual coding. Also, user stories are going to describe the features of app from user perspectives. So with user story 1, we're going to add tasks, edit, delete, and view them. So here we have a summary of what we've looked into right now. So with these tools, we have explained and see examples of how they have to be integrated to our application, and we've also looked into the purpose of them. In our learning outcome tool, we have to have the ability to design and document user interface this time to meet our client brief. So we've been given the same case scenario where the client brief says that the client requires a mobile task management app to help users organize and track the daily tasks. This will now allow them to add, edit, and delete tasks, set deadline, and mark tasks as completed. So the user interface should be intuitive and suitable for mobile devices. What do we mean by intuitive? Is that with these tools, we can now effectively design our user interface. So we have to be able to create storyboard, navigation design, screen content design, and wireframes. So what are storyboards? Our storyboards are now going to help us visualize our user's journey through the app by illustrating the key interactions. So we have here a simplified storyboard for our task management app. So where we're now going to have our home screen, where all our when our user opens the app, we now view the list of objects. Add task, where we can have the ability to navigate and add tasks to the screen, edit them, delete them, and also view tasks details. Navigation design is very important because it's going to outline how users move through the app. So as we said, it has to be user-friendly, has to give us the ability to navigate, to add tasks on our screen. Also, we have to have the ability to view the details on the screen. Screen content design. With this, we now have the ability to design details with the elements which are presented on each screen, such as button, forms, and text fields. So this is very important because, again, on our homepage, we can have this named as task list. We will now have the ability to add new tasks. Also, we'll have task details and the ability to edit our tasks. Wireframe, as we mentioned before, are software tools that allow us to make some sketch, some prototype, and there are loads of softwares such as Figma, Adobe XD, and so on. So again, now we can look into storyboard. So we said the purpose of storyboard is to visualize user interaction and sequence of action. Navigation design allows us to outline the flow between different screens. Screen content design shows us the detail of the elements presented on each screen and the layout. And lastly, wireframe provides a visual presentation of the app layout and elements. With our merit tasks, we're now going to justify our design decision for both the functionality and user interface. So when it comes to designing mobile task management, we know that this is going to involve critical decisions for us to ensure that we have functionality and user interface that are going to meet what are our client expectations. So when it comes to functionality design decision, it is important to look into task management features. So the core functionality of our app are going to revolve around managing tasks. So this will now include adding, editing, deleting tasks, and so on. So the justification for this is that features are very essential for any task management application, where we're going to be ensuring that we can efficiently manage their to-do list and deadlines. When it comes to the data models, is now going to include a user model and task model, which is within a clear relationship between them. Reason for this is that the relational model has to ensure that data integrity and supports multi-user functionality with a crucial for scalability and personalization on the app. Modular code structure. So the reason for having this is that the code is organized into modules for the user management tasks, and the main justification that we now have is that modular code are going to enhance maintainability, readability, and scalability, and they're now going to allow easier update and integration of new features in the future. So what the reason of using Python? Python is chosen for its simplicity, readability, and extensive library support. So it has a rich ecosystem. It's going now to include Flash form, backend development, and all the libraries for the database interaction. Testing and debugging are going to consist in testing, where they're going to be including unit test and integration test. This approach has to ensure that all the application is reliable, with bugs identified and resolved as early as possible in the development lifecycle. User interface design decision. So we're now looking to having a simplicity and clarity. As we said, a wireframe has to be very intuitive, where this design has to be done with a simple and clear layout to minimize any soft user effort. Also, we need to have a consistent design, where we have to have consistent use of colors, font, button style across all the app. Also, it is important that this is responsive. So the design has to be responsive and suitable for both mobile and desktop view. Wireframe again, as we mentioned, these are going to be created for key screens, where we're going to have home page, ability to add task, view this task, and edit them. User stories. The reason for having these is that user stories were developed to capture the need and goals of our end users. Navigation flow has to be a clear and logical navigation flow, and it has to also allow our users to easily move between our screens. So again, here we have a summary of how we going to justify the use of all these aspects. So to conclude this session, we can now say that the design decision for both functionality and user interface of task management app and have to be based on ensuring that the app meets our client brief, provides seamless user experience, and is maintainable and scalable. So we have to be now focusing on simplifying, consistency, and user-centered design, where this app aim to be both effective and intuitive, and enhancing productivity of our user satisfaction. So looking at our assignment brief, these are all details that will now be useful when it comes to looking into the functionality of our proposed solution. So we have to have the ability to include everything we discuss about in this learning outcome, but we also have to have the ability to justify the design decision for both functionality and user interface. So then second tutorial focuses very much on task number 2. And is there any question for me?
Thanks, Victor. No, I think that's all fairly straightforward. A lot of that sort of stuff that we've covered, things like, for example, wireframes, flowcharts, entity relationship,
Yeah.
relationship diagrams, all very similar things that was covered in the first unit around like systems development. Really, I wrote a lot about those things already in that context, talking about using wireframes as an example and stuff. So a lot of it's actually fairly familiar, and things like storyboarding and stuff like that I've done in sort of more project management related tasks. So again, that's sort of fairly familiar. So yeah, I think that all looks fairly straightforward.
So you shouldn't have any problem with task number 2 then.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I hope so. Yes, no, it all looks fine. It's got put into a PowerPoint presentation, hasn't it? So that again, that's fine. I've done that in pretty much I think every unit so far. So yeah, brilliant. No, that's all really helpful, Victor. Thank you.
Okay, Johnny, thank you for that. So if there is no any other question, I can end today's session.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll see you next week.
Catch you next Monday. Have a good week, Victor. Speak to you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.